Welcome back to Call in Investing, where we dive deep into the forces shaping our financial future. Today, we're tackling a topic that's sending shockwaves across the globe, the intertwined ambitions and potential disruptions of Donald Trump and Elon Musk. We're going to unpack a series of interconnected events, proposals, and frankly radical ideas that could reshape not just the American economy, but the international order. Imagine a world where political alliances shift, economic powerhouses are challenged, and the very structure of government is dismantled. That's what we are going to discuss. This isn't just about headlines, it's about understanding the potential implications for your investments, your portfolio, and your financial well-being. So, buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey to explore Trump, Musk, and the future. A world reshaped. So we've set the stage, a world in flux, with powerful figures making bold moves. Now, let's dive into the specifics of one of the most controversial proposals, Trump's plan for peace in Ukraine, and I want to emphasize plan, because as we'll see, it's less a negotiation and more a dictation. First, the core of the proposal. Ukraine would be required to cede its eastern territory, essentially recognizing the current reality on the ground, and definitively abandon any aspirations of joining NATO. This, right off the bat, is a massive concession, effectively rewarding Russia's aggression, but it gets even more one-sided. Russia would face no war reparations, no sanctions, all those frozen assets returned. It's a complete reset, as if the past 3 years of conflict never happened. The estimated 300 billion euros of frozen Russian assets would be unfrozen and returned, normalizing relations. Think about the implications of that for a moment. And what about Ukraine? Well, they're presented with a staggering bill, $350 billion to be repaid to the US, despite Zelensky claiming they only received $75 billion in aid. This discrepancy alone is a huge red flag, and it sets up a dynamic of long-term debt and dependence. The one, and perhaps only, concession made is that the United States will support Ukraine's membership into the European Union by the year 2030. Another important point is that the US will not provide any fund for Ukraine's reconstruction. Finally, the plan envisions a diplomatic thaw, with Trump and Putin exchanging visits and even talk of Russia rejoining the G7. This is presented as a return to global stability, but it's a stability built on very shaky ground and at a very high cost, primarily to Ukraine. So, we've laid out the terms of this proposed peace deal, a deal that frankly feels more like an ultimatum. Now, let's examine the fallout. How did the world, and specifically Ukraine and Europe, react to this proposition? Unsurprisingly, the overwhelming response is that the plan disproportionately favors Russia. And it does. It's hard to argue otherwise. Russia secures its territorial gains, effectively legitimizing the annexation of Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. The lifting of sanctions. That's a massive win for Putin, allowing Russia to re-enter the global economic stage with its coffers replenished. It is a significant jail-tail victory, no question about it, for Ukraine. The picture is bleak. They lose substantial terrain in their sting that has been fiercely contested, with immense human cost. And on top of that, they're saddled with a massive debt burden to the United States, a debt that, based on the numbers, seems questionable to say the least. Imagine the long-term implications of that for a nation trying to rebuild. And what about Europe? The reaction across the continent has been largely one of outrage and a deep sense of betrayal. Many European nations view this plan as not just abandoning Ukraine, but as undermining the very principles of international law and security. They see it as a dangerous precedent, effectively rewarding aggression and potentially emboldening further expansionist moves. Imagine being a European leader, having invested heavily in supporting Ukraine only to see this proposal put on the table. You might be calling this a betrayal now. To here is some speculation, and this is important to consider, that this entire plan is a trial balloon, a way for the Trump administration to gauge reactions, to see how far they can push, to test the limits of what's acceptable. It's a classic negotiation tactic. Start with an extreme position and then work your way back. But the question remains, how much damage is done in the process? How much trust is eroded? And what are the long-term consequences of this kind of diplomatic brinkmanship? We will talk about this later, so stay tuned. So, we've seen the broad strokes of this proposed peace plan and the largely negative reaction from Europe. But the plot thickens, doesn't it? Because alongside the geoling maneuvering, here is a very significant economic undercurrent, a struggle for resources, and that brings us to a critical and frankly rather tense negotiation surrounding Ukraine's mineral wealth. Now, picture this. Zelensky, already facing immense pressure, reportedly refused to sign a document that would have granted the United States rights to a staggering 50% of Ukraine's future mineral reserves, 50%. Let that sink in for a moment. This isn't some minor trade agreement. This is a claim on half of a nation's potential resource wealth for the next 50 years. Why is this so important? Well, Ukraine isn't just any country when it comes to minerals. It possesses substantial deposits of resources that are absolutely crucial for modern economies and, importantly, for U.S. economic and national security. We're talking about things like rare earth elements, lithium, the building blocks of high-tech industries, electric vehicles, and advanced weaponry. The U.S. Geological Survey has even certified that Ukraine has 50 kinds of minerals that are critical to the U.S. economy. These are resources that the U.S. needs to maintain its competitive edge, particularly in the face of growing global competition. And here is where the aid versus investment question gets really murky. Trump is reportedly seeking $500 billion worth of these minerals as ostensibly repayment for U.S. aid provided to Ukraine. Now, consider the scale of that demand. While some media outlets claim Ukraine has around $10 trillion in mineral wealth, the number $500 billion is still relatively realistic, considering a lot of mineral resources remain unexplored. It is not a small number. And also, recall the discrepancy in the aid figure, Zelensky saying $75 billion received, Trump claiming $350 billion. It is clear that some business calculations are at play, not a simple support for Ukraine's democracy. Zelensky, for his part, is in an incredibly difficult position. He's publicly stated that he prioritizes U.S. access to these minerals, emphasizing the greater contribution the U.S. has made. He believes, in the order of fairness, that the U.S. has the right to get access first, over other nations. It's a delicate balancing act, acknowledging the need for external support while trying to safeguard Ukraine's long-term economic sovereignty. But the power dynamics are clearly skewed, and this mineral deal occurs the complex and often uncomfortable realities of international relations in a world where resources are increasingly strategic assets. The repercussions of Trump's proposed peace plan, particularly the stark economic implications for Ukraine, set a tense backdrop for the annual Munich Security Conference. This wasn't just any diplomatic gathering, it was a flashpoint, and Vice President Pence's speech ignited the powder keg. Imagine a room full of seasoned diplomats, defense ministers, and heads of state expecting the usual platitudes about transatlantic cooperation. And instead, they get a verbal bombshell. Pence's address wasn't a call for unity, it was a Kent-Deb challenge, a fundamental questioning of whether the US and Europe even share the same values anymore. He directly questioned the core principles that have underpinned the Western alliance for decades, leaving the audience, by all accounts, stunned. Reports from the conference describe a palpable sense of shock, with European media outlets going so far as to call the speech a fatal blow to the entire event. It was that disruptive. Now, it's crucial to understand that this wasn't just rhetoric. This speech laid bare the growing chasm between the US under the Trump administration and the traditional European powers. We're talking about a fundamental rift, a questioning of the very foundations of the NATO alliance and the post-World War II order. This is a significant departure, and the implications for global stability, and by extension global markets, are profound. And we, as investors, need to be aware, however, and this is important, not everyone was condemning Pence. Figures like Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, known for his own nationalist and often controversial views, actually supported Pence's stance. This reveals a deeper and perhaps more troubling trend, a growing divide within Europe itself, with some factions aligning more closely with Trump's America First ideology than with the traditional European consensus. This internal European friction is a critical factor to watch, as it will undoubtedly influence the continent's response to U.S. policy shifts and potentially impact investment decisions across the board. But the drama at the Munich Security Conference didn't end with Pence's speech. Oh no, it was just the opening act, because, behind the scenes, something even more intriguing and potentially more consequential was unfolding. We're talking about a secret meeting, clandestine flights, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. First, let's talk about this secret meeting. Reports surfaced of a high-level meeting between a Russian official and, you guessed it, Vice President Pence himself. But this wasn't your typical diplomatic handshake and photo op. This was covert. And the logistics alone raise eyebrows. A U.S. military aircraft was reportedly used to fly this Russian official into Moscow and then to Europe. This is highly unusual, to say the least, especially given the current Jolon climate and the fact that it was the first instance since 2022, when the war broke out, that a U.S. military plane entered Russian airspace. It bypasses all the usual protocols and sanctions, and it begs the question, what was so urgent, so sensitive that it required this level of secrecy and this mode of transport? The European nations were reportedly very confused, and then, adding fuel to the fire, to here's Pence's other meeting, or rather the meeting he didn't have. He declined a meeting with German Chancellor Scholz, the host of the conference, a significant diplomatic snub. Instead, he chose to meet privately with Alice Weidel, a leader of the far-right Alternative for Germany, AfD party. Now, the AfD is a controversial party, to put it mildly, known for its anti-immigrant stance and Eurosceptic views. This meeting, lasting 30 minutes, sends a clear signal, a signal that the Trump administration is willing to engage with, and perhaps even cultivate, alternative political forces in Europe, forces that are often at odds with the established order. With the upcoming German election and the AfD potentially becoming the second largest party, this move carries significant weight. Finally, let's not forget the U.S. Defense Secretary's contribution to this unfolding drama. In a separate address at NATO headquarters, he essentially threatened a withdrawal of U.S. security commitments to Europe. He wasn't subtle about it. He demanded that European nations take primary responsibility for their own defense and for Ukraine's defense, echoing Trump's call for a drastic increase in NATO defense spending. He even put it bluntly that the U.S. is Uncle Sam, but not Uncle Sucker. This is a direct challenge to the decades-long security architecture of Europe, and it leaves many wondering about the future of the transatlantic alliance. All of these actions, taken together, paint a picture of an administration that's not just rethinking its foreign policy, but actively disrupting it. And the implications for global stability and for our investments are frankly enormous. So the secret meetings, the snubs, the threats, it all points to a fundamental shift in the US-Europe relationship. And this isn't just about diplomatic niceties. It has profound implications for the global balance of power, and crucially, for our investments. We're seeing in real time the unraveling of a decades-old alliance, and the emergence of a much more transactional, much more unilateral approach from the United States. This brings us to a critical juncture. The very structure of European security, the US under Trump, is essentially saying, we're not going to foot the bill anymore. They're demanding that Europe take primary responsibility, not just for its own defense, but significantly for the defense of Ukraine as well. This is a complete reversal of the post-World War II order, where the US served as the ultimate guarantor of European security through NATO, and the specific number being thrown around 5%. Trump is pushing for NATO members to increase their defense spending to a staggering 5% of their GDP. Now, to put that in perspective, most European nations currently spend far less than that, with some, like Spain, hovering around 1.28%. We are talking about a massive, and in many cases politically unfeasible, increase in military expenditure. This is not a minor budget adjustment, it's a fundamental reordering of national priorities. What would this mean in concrete terms? Well, according to Bloomberg Economic Research, Europe could be facing an additional $3.1 trillion in defense expenditure over the next decade. $3.1 trillion. Just try to wrap your head around that number. Where is that money going to come from? Higher taxes? Cuts to social programs? Increased borrowing? Any of those options carry significant economic and political risks, and perhaps not surprisingly, a major beneficiary of this increased spending would be U.S. arms manufacturers. The irony is pretty thick, isn't it? Ultimately, what we're witnessing is Trump applying his signature business negotiation tactics, maximum pressure, brinkmanship, and a willingness to walk away to the realm of international security. He's treating alliances like business deals, and he's not afraid to upset the established order to get what he wants. But the question is, what are the unintended consequences of this approach? What happens when the bedrock of global stability is shaken? We, as investors, need to be prepared for a potentially very turbulent future. So we've explored the immediate in-base, the diplomatic firestorm, the economic anxieties, and the very real consequences for Ukraine. But what's the bigger picture here? What's the overarching strategy driving these seemingly disruptive moves? This brings us to the core of Trump's vision, a dramatically reshaped global order, with America, once again, firmly at the center, but in a very different way than before. This isn't about endless foreign entanglements or playing global policeman. It is a complete and determined strategy. Trump's aim, and it's becoming increasingly clear, is to withdraw from the extensive security commitments in Europe. And the withdrawal is not for any reason, it is for a larger strategy. It is to shift the focus and the resources squarely back onto strengthening the United States internally, and preparing for what he sees as the real long-term challenge, strategic competition with China. And it makes perfect sense, think of it this way. Every dollar spent on maintaining military bases in Europe, every ounce of diplomatic energy expended on navigating European politics, is a dollar, not spent on rebuilding American infrastructure or investing in American technology or countering China's growing influence in the Pacific. That is, in the view of Trump's team, what the strategy is ending the Russia-Ukraine war from this perspective isn't just about resolving a single conflict. It's a crucial step in a much larger strategic realignment. It's about freeing up resources, disentangling the U.S. from a costly and, in their view, distracting conflict, and allowing the U.S. to concentrate its power and attention on the real game, the great power competition with China. And you can see this play directly into a larger U.S. narrative of getting itself out of the mess to refocus now. Here is a critical point, and one that often gets overlooked. NATO's very existe. Its purpose has historically depended on the perception of a threat. For decades, that threat was the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, that threat arguably became a somewhat amorphous global instability. But now, under Trump's vision, that threat is being redefined and sharpened. It's Russia, but not an actively aggressive Russia, engaged in a full-scale war with Ukraine, but it contained Russia, a Russia that serves as a convenient foil, a justification for NATO's continued existence, but one that doesn't require constant, costly intervention. It's a delicate balance and a potentially very dangerous game. And the final point to keep in mind is that both Donald Trump and Elon Musk are openly, and in some ways brazenly challenging the established order. That is no news. They're not playing by the old rules. They're rewriting them. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is of course a matter of debate, and we'll explore the potential consequences in detail. But one thing is certain. The world is changing rapidly, and we, as investors, need to understand these shifts to navigate the turbulent waters ahead. We've been discussing Trump's grand strategy, a shift away from European entanglements, a renewed focus on domestic strength, and a strategic pivot towards confronting China. But how does this translate into action? What are the concrete steps being taken to, quote-unquote, make America great again? And that's where Elon Musk, in a rather radical plan to dismantle the federal government, comes into the picture. This is where things get, shall we say, interesting though. Now you might be thinking, government cuts, that's nothing new. But Musk isn't talking about trimming around the edges or finding efficiencies. He's advocating for something far more drastic. Complete elimination of entire federal agencies, not reducing them, not reforming them, but getting rid of them altogether. Imagine whole departments, thousands of employees, decades of established processes gone. He even mentions the weed-pulling analogy. He states that we need to remove the entire federal agencies, rather than leaving some parts of them, like pulling grass. It must be pulled from the root, or it will grow again. He really is meaning business. This is not a subtle proposal. It's a wrecking ball aimed at the very heart of the American administrative state. And the potential consequences? Well, they're enormous. We're talking about significant political and social unrest, a level of disruption that could send shockwaves through the entire system. You have this plan, you get rid of the agencies, and suddenly you create a big vacuum. What fills it? Who enforces the rules and who pays? And of course, from our perspective here at Call-in Investing, the immediate concern is the potential for instability in markets, uncertainty. And this kind of radical restructuring is uncertainty on steroids. It could easily trigger a significant market downturn as investors grapple with the unknown consequences of such a dramatic shift. It is a very sensitive subject, so the market will definitely react. Trump, for his part, is echoing this call for drastic cuts, although perhaps not quite as explicitly as Musk. He's aiming to slash a staggering $1 trillion in government spending. Just think about the scale of that number. That's not just adjusting the budget. That's fundamentally reshaping the role of the federal government in the American economy. And the ripple effects of that kind of cut would be felt across every sector, every industry, and of course every portfolio. So, we've talked about Musk's grand vision of dismantling entire government aids, a truly radical proposition. But what does that look like in practice? Where is this theoretical wrecking ball actually swinging? Well, this is where we get into the specifics, the real-world targets of his unprecedented cost-cutting and efficiency-seeking campaign. And the picture that emerges is, well, it's breathtaking in its scope. First up, and serving as a chilling example of what might be to come, is the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. Now, you might think, okay, some budget cuts, some restructuring, right, wrong, well everyone, and welcome back to Call-in Investing. USAID was effectively gutted, slashed by a staggering 97%. 97%. Imagine virtually an entire agency with its global network, its programs, its personnel, just gone. This isn't reform, it's demolition, and that sends a very clear message to the rest of the federal government. No one is safe, but the cuts, or rather, the investigates, don't stop there. Musk's newly formed efficiency department, and that name alone is telling, isn't it? Isn't just looking at obscure agencies. They're digging into the very heart of the American financial system. We're talking about the Treasury, the Department of Education, and, most shockingly, even the Federal Reserve, the Fed, the independent institution that controls monetary policy that's supposed to be shielded from political interference, is now under the microscope of Musk's team. The implications of that are frankly enormous. Imagine the potential for pressure, for influence, for a fundamental shift in how monetary policy is conducted, and the justification for all of this. Trump claims to have unearthed massive systemic waste and fraud. He's talking about billion, potentially even trillions of dollars that have been allegedly mismanaged or outright stolen. Now, whether those numbers are accurate or inflated, whether this is a genuine attempt to clean up government or a politically motivated purge, is open for debate. And there are rentably valid arguments on both sides. But the effect is undeniable. A climate of fear and uncertainty within the federal bureaucracy, and a potential reshaping of the government's role in the economy that could have profound and long-lasting consequences for all of us and our investments. We've been dissecting Musk's role in this sweeping governmental overhaul, focusing on the efficiency department and its, shall we say, aggressive approach. But let's shift our gaze to the other side of the equation, to Trump's economic policies, specifically his stance on trade, because, remember, this is all interconnected. Musk's domestic cuts are, in part, designed to free up resources for Trump's broader economic agenda. And that agenda is where the term America First takes on a whole new and potentially disruptive meaning. So imagine you are a business owner, importing goods from Canada or Mexico. You built your supply chains, your pricing models, your entire business around a certain level of free trade, right? Well, under Trump's proposal, you'd be facing a sudden, sharp asterisk, 25% tariff, 25%. That's not a minor adjustment. That's a seismic shift that could wipe out profit margins, force price increases, and potentially disrupt entire industries. And this isn't just some hypothetical threat, it's a concrete proposal. He proposed a tariff of 25% for goods. Just let this sink in for a while, but it doesn't stop there. Trump isn't just targeting our immediate neighbors. He's advocating for what he calls reciprocal tariffs on all countries. The idea is essentially, if you tax our goods, we'll tax yours. Sounds simple enough on the surface, but in the complex web of global trade, it's a recipe for chaos. Imagine a tit-for-tat tariff war escalating across the globe, disrupting supply chains, driving up prices, and potentially triggering a global recession. It is not a fun scenario to think of, really. The stated goal, of course, is to revive American manufacturing, to bring back jobs, to address what Trump describes as the hollowing out of U.S. industry. He wants to reverse the trend of industries leaving the country and have manufacturing come back to the U.S. It's a compelling narrative, particularly for those who feel left behind by globalization. But the question is, at what cost? Can you really turn back the clock on decades of economic integration? And what are the unintended consequences of such a drastic shift? And to further emphasize the America First theme, there are the planned withdrawals from international agreements, the Paris Climate Accord gone, the World Health Organization gone, the rationale saving money. According to Trump, these agreements don't serve U.S. interests, and the funds allocated to them could be better used elsewhere. For the Paris Climate Accord, he justified that he did not want to play China's game. For the WHO, he expressed that the organization's relationship with China is way too close. He is cutting costs wherever he can, and will do anything to realize his vision. Again, this is a clear break from the established international order, and it signals a willingness to go it alone, regardless of the diplomatic fallout. It's a bold, some would say reckless, strategy, and the implications for the global economy and for our investments are profound. So, we've seen this sweeping, almost revolutionary approach to both domestic policy and international relations. Trump and Musk are, essentially, attempting to rewrite the rules of the game. But is this all just a series of impulsive decisions, a chaotic scramble for power and profit? Or is there a deeper, perhaps even predictable, pattern at play? That's where we need to consider a fascinating and somewhat unsettling framework, Ray Dalio's Empire Cycle Theory. And I find this gives a great background and overall summary to what we've just discussed. Now, for those unfamiliar, Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the world's largest hedge funds, has extensively studied the rise and fall of empires throughout history. And what he's found is a recurring cycle, a pattern of boom and bust that seems to play out with remarkable consistency across centuries and civilizations. And the core insight: overexpansion, particularly military overextension, coupled with the accumulation of unsustainable levels of debt, almost inevitably leads to imperial decline. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? Consider this in light of everything we have been discussing. The United States, for decades, has maintained a vast global military presence, engaging in numerous conflicts and maintaining alliances around the world. Simultaneously, the national debt has ballooned to, frankly, astronomical levels. We talked about this in the previous slides. According to Dalio's theory, this isn't just a coincidence. It's a symptom of a system stretched to its limits, a system potentially nearing a turning point. Trump's America First policy, with its emphasis on withdrawing from international commitments, focusing on domestic issues, and addressing the debt crisis, can be seen through this lens as a kind of instinctive, perhaps even desperate attempt to correct course. It's as if he's saying, we can't be the world's policeman anymore. We need to focus on our own problems before it's too late. It's a retreat, a consolidation, a recognition that the empire, as it has been, is no longer sustainable. And the efforts made by Musk is exactly to help with the resource management, if you will. Now, here is where it gets particularly relevant to us as investors. Dalio's theory suggests that we're currently in a stage characterized by excessive money, printing and credit expand. Sound familiar? Think about the massive stimulus packages, the low interest rate environment. We've been living in a world awash in liquidity, but according to the cycle, this stage is often followed by a period of significant upheaval Dalio calls his revolution and war stage. This can manifest in various ways: internal conflict, social unrest, even war. And that obviously has profound implications for markets. Think about the increased volatility, the potential for sharp declines, the need for careful risk management. This isn't just theoretical, it's a warning sign that we need to take seriously. The next stage is revolution and war. Let that sink in. We've been dissecting this intricate web of political maneuvering, economic upheaval, and this massive, almost revolutionary, restructuring of the US government. We saw how Trump and Musk have been working together to realize their visions now. A question naturally arises. Why? Why is Elon Musk, a man with a reported net worth of $400 billion, involving himself in something so messy, so potentially dangerous? He certainly doesn't need the money. And, frankly, given his established ventures with SpaceX and Tesla, he doesn't need more power or influence. So, what's driving him? It's highly unlikely that this is about personal financial gain. At his level of wealth, another billion here or there is, practically speaking, irrelevant. No, this goes beyond wealth and power. It points towards something deeper, something more ideological. Musk has always been driven by a strong, some would say, unconvincing vision of the future. A vision that encompasses everything from space exploration to artificial intelligence, to now apparently the structure of the American government. Now, here is been some, let's call it informed speculation about another possible motivation. And it's a bit more Machiavellian. Some sources suggest that Musk's deep dive into the inner workings of these government agencies, his army of data analysts, and yes, potentially, hackers, sifting through mountains of information, that it's not just about efficiency. It might also be about gathering intelligence, gathering information on powerful politicians, on their dealings, their connections. Essentially, acquiring leverage. Think of it as a kind of insurance policy, a way to protect himself from potential blowback, to ensure that no one can easily target him or his enterprises. It is the digital version of mutually assured destruction. It is a bit of a stretch, but definitely a possibility, and perhaps the most telling indicator of the risks involved. Musk has reportedly prepared his will, meticulously outlining the distribution of his assets. This isn't the action of someone embarking on a routine business venture. This is the action of someone who understands that they're stepping into a potentially very dangerous arena. Someone who's aware that there could be significant, even life-threatening consequences to their actions. He's playing a high-stakes game and he knows it. The question is he doing it purely for idealistic reasons, for a strategic advantage, or some complex combination of both? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. I am genuinely curious to hear your perspectives on this. We've painted a picture of sweeping changes, bold ambitions, and a radical reshaping of both the US government and its role in the world. And this is a huge, but all of this grand strategy hinges on one critical assumption, that it will work. And that, my friends, is where the real risks come into play. It's one thing to propose dismantling entire government agencies. It's quite another to actually do it without causing widespread chaos. Consider a situation where you plan to do a reform, but it goes south. His history is littered with examples of radical reforms that, despite the best intentions, ended up backfiring spectacularly. They often face fierce opposition, not just from political opponents, but from entrenched interests, from the very people whose livelihoods and power structures are threatened. Remember the backlash when previous administrations attempted even minor reforms? Well, multiply that by 1,000, and you start to get a sense of the potential resistance to what Trump and Musk are proposing. The pushback will likely be intense, prolonged, and potentially destabilizing. And what if the resistance comes from very powerful groups? The reform may very well fail, and that brings us to the second and perhaps even more alarming risk, the potential for a complete collapse of the entrenched bureaucracy. This isn't just about cutting budgets, it's about undermining the very foundations of how the government operates. Decades of established processes, networks of expertise, institutional memory, all of that is potentially being thrown out the window. Now, some might argue that's a good thing, that the system is bloated and inefficient. But even if you agree with that premise, you have to acknowledge the risk of unintended consequences. What happens when the system that, however imperfectly, manages everything from food safety to air traffic control to national security is suddenly gone, or at least severely weakened? It is a recipe for disaster. The government may simply collapse. And finally, let's not shy away from the most extreme, but increasingly discussed, possibility: internal conflict. We're already seeing a deeply polarized nation, with political divisions that seem to widen by the day. Now, add to that, mix a radical restructuring of government, a potential economic upheaval, and a sense of grievance among those who feel left behind, and you have a recipe for social unrest. Some are even talking about the potential for a cold civil war, a period of intense political and social strife that could, in the worst-case scenario, escalate into actual violence. This, clearly, is a very, very serious situation. From an investor's perspective, all of this translates into one thing: extreme volatility, the potential for market crashes, for sudden shifts in policy, for a prolonged period of uncertainty. It's all on the table. This isn't a time for complacency. It's a time for careful risk assessment, for diversification, and for staying informed, because the future, as it's being shaped by Trump and Musk, is anything but predictable. And that brings us finally to Hume. We journeyed through a landscape of political intrigue, economic disruption, and frankly, a pretty unsettling vision of the future, according to some. I've presented a lot of information, a lot of analysis, and hopefully a lot of food for thought. But this isn't a one-way street. This channel, Colin and Vic, thrives on the engagement, the insights, and the questions from you, our community. So, first things first, if you found this deep dive even remotely valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It's a small action, but it makes a huge difference in helping us reach more people and continue producing this kind of in-depth analysis. Seriously, every click counts. But more importantly, I want to hear from you. We've covered a lot of ground today, from secret meetings in Munich to radical plans to dismantle the US government. What are your thoughts? What are your predictions? Do you see this as a bold new direction for America, a dangerous descent into chaos, or something in between? Share your perspectives, your concerns, your insights in the comment section below. Let's start a conversation. Let's debate. Let's challenge each other's assumptions, because, ultimately, understanding these complex forces is a collective effort. What specific aspect of this whole situation are you most concerned about from an investment perspective? Are you worried about market allocation? Are you rethinking your portfolio allocation? Are you looking for opportunities amidst the chaos? Let's learn from each other. I truly believe that the collective intelligence of this community is far greater than any single analyst, myself included. So thank you for your time, for your attention, and for being a part of the Colin investing community. I genuinely appreciate your engagement, and I look forward to reading your comments and continuing this conversation. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and stay invested wisely. And remember that I am always here to help you navigate the complexities of the financial world.